It's an interesting time capsule of how terrible our history is. I realized that this is an ode for Jane Austen. I am just so thrilled that I ended up reading it because it introduced me to an author that I want to explore more. Hi everyone, welcome back to Leandra the TBR Zero. It has been a while since I have recorded a video as well as uploaded one. The last one I recorded was actually another mystery vlog, and I haven't even put it up yet because life has been busy. But today, because it is now the 1st of May, I thought that I would discuss how April went and just reflect on some of my reading habits during this crazy month. So without further ado, let's get into it. So grad school has really been kicking my butt this month, and I think it's just because we're getting towards the end of the semester. At this point, I only have a few weeks to go until I finally have summer and more free time to read and just do other passions that have been calling to me. But I'm still not disappointed with the number of books I was able to read in April. I ended up reading 7 books, and 3 of them were for grad school. So I think that kind of helped me up my numbers a little bit. The first book that I ended up finishing for April was The Awakening by Kate Chopin, and that book was published in 1899, so towards the end of the 19th century. Really gave us a good look into gender roles as well as societal expectations and pressures, specifically in the upper class of Creole society in New Orleans. And this was one of the books I ended up having to read for one of my classes. I was really glad to return to that novel, or novella, I actually think it is, because no, it's not. It's actually a novel. This was a reread for me. I read it first when I was 16 in high school, and so it was really fascinating to come back to it 10 some years later and see if my feelings about it have changed. I think when I was younger, I thought that this book was a masterpiece, and I'm not saying it isn't. I really appreciate how pivotal this novel has been to feminist theory and just paralleling it to modern day issues when it comes to gender roles and issues along those lines, specifically for the expectations of women as well as the expectations of men when it comes to marriage and children. But I am not as, I suppose, enamored with the novel as much as other people have been. So I ended up giving this book 3 stars. I think my 16-year-old self gave it 5. With that said, even though I'm personally giving it 3 stars, in my moment of life right now, with 27 years under my belt, I don't think that this is a book you should ignore if it is on your shelf. I am 100% the better for having read it, for having reread it even, and yeah, I think that this is a classic that everyone should read, even if it doesn't end up being one of their favorites. The second book that I ended up finishing in April was Craig Rice's 8 Faces at 3. This is a Penslar classic that I just couldn't help but buy. And no, it wasn't a part of my subscription. I just got really excited when it was chosen for the Mysterious Bookshops book club for April. And I am just so thrilled that I ended up reading it because it introduced me to an author that I want to explore more. Craig Rice is actually a pseudonym name. The author's real name is Georgiana Ann Randolph Craig, which is quite a mouthful, so I understand why she may have shortened it to Craig Rice. I was pleasantly surprised that this is a woman, and honestly, once you get into it, the surprise fades, because one of the most brilliant characters who is so fun, so eccentric and crazy and clever is Helene Brand. She is one among many amateur detectives in this book, and this is actually the first book Yeah, of the John J. Malone series. John J. Malone is basically a lawyer for the guilty. His clients are always guilty, which is quite interesting because that makes him a great character. In one part of the book, from his perspective-ish, we understand that he believes that ethics don't actually exist, and if they did, we wouldn't need lawyers. So I think that his morality is a bit gray and not very righteous, you know, as opposed to some other detectives we see. So I really appreciated that odd spin on the detective. And he's not the only detective. We've got Helen Brand. We've got Jake, I think his name is, if I can remember. It's been a while. And by a while, a couple weeks. Jake Justice, which I also love that the last name is Justice. These three, among others, are just a band of detectives. They often, late at night or maybe in the morning even, come together and just exchange clues, things that they've discovered, and then pretty much throw theories up in the air and see what sticks. And it makes it very fun. A woman, Holly, she has been framed almost, or at least suspected of murdering her aunt, and no one understands how or why anyone else would have done it, since she's the only one who seems to have had a motive, and she was the only one supposedly in the house when the crime happened. So it's just a whirlwind, crazy mystery. It happens in Chicago. These people are partying all the time in between, trying to discover how this aunt actually died. And yeah, it was brilliant. I had so much fun, and I can't wait to read more by Craig Rice. And I gave this one 5 stars. The third book that I ended up reading for April was the second book that I'm going to be including in a mystery vlog. The first one was Craig Rice's novel, and it's actually so funny that I read these two together because the book I'm talking about is Jonathan Latimer's Headed for a Hearse. This is another Penslick classic, and this one was a part of my subscription. So these two books both are based in Chicago. While this one is hard-boiled detective fiction and this one was more cozy, crazy mystery, they both also include falsely accused or falsely convicted, innocent people, where the detectives are not only trying to find out who did it, but they're trying to clear the name of someone who is at risk of going to the chair, if we understand how severe this is. And while all of these similarities were so fun to bring together in a vlog, I ended up having a very different reading experience with this book than I did with the one I just discussed. And that's because this book significantly disappointed me. Now, most times when we're discussing mysteries, we think that they are disappointing because of the mystery aspect. Maybe the solution was disappointing, or maybe the mystery in itself wasn't as complex as we would have liked.
That is not the case with this book.
I found the mystery extremely complex. I adored the solution, and I actually had a lot of fun making up my own theories, and I ended up being right for the most part, which is brilliant. But I'm disappointed because while the mystery is so fun, Jonathan Latimer is a human being that I wish I could punch if he was still alive, because the amount of racism, voyeurism, sexism, and just drunken, disorderly conduct in this book is ridiculous. It is honestly flabbergasting that not only in the dialogue, I feel like there's a difference. If the dialogue has it, then we can kind of pinpoint it that that's potentially some of the character development within certain characters, and that's their individual flaws. But it was also in the narration, and when it's in the narration, and this is all third person, it's not a first person narrative, except for is it during? No, not even while we're in the head of the falsely convicted man. All of it's third person, if I can remember correctly. So by being in the narration, that's indicative of what the author's thinking. I know that you can separate narrator and author to an extent, but when it comes to racist and sexist thoughts, no, like that's literally what Jonathan Latimer is thinking. And when it comes to racism, we're talking BIPOC, Asian American, Italians, Jewish people. Literally the list goes on for the number of times this book attacks some other minority. And while nowadays Italian Americans necessarily don't have the same type of struggle that other minorities or people of color experience today, back in the day, we should know that Italians and Irish Americans were severely discriminated against. And this book shows that. It's an interesting time capsule of how terrible our history is, even though today we're not perfect. It was 100% worse back then for everyone. And the derogatory slurs, at one point I almost had to stop, especially when it came to the derogatory slurs towards a certain Black filler character. And it really like angered me so much to read this book. And I haven't even gotten to the sexism. There's so much voyeuristic content in which every character who's a man, whether you're the detective that we're meant to be rooting for or any other side character, they are always looking at a woman's face, her body, her clothing, and assessing where she fits in the spectrum of societal expectations of beauty. During the actual reveal, every single man, whether it's a witness, a suspect, or the detectives, had to observe Miss Brentino, one of the characters, and just fawn over her beauty. And I was like, you gotta stop objectifying these women. It's getting ridiculous. So now that I've gone on that rant, I ended up giving this book 1 star because of how much it pretty much pissed me off. I am really upset because the mystery is super complex. I think that Jonathan Latimer probably was a clever writer, and I would have liked to read more books by him if there weren't so many horrible issues when it comes to pretty much putting down every single person who isn't a white man. You know, that's not what we're here for. So yeah, 1 star, would not read, would not recommend, will not read in the future. Next. Hey everybody, this is your mid-video reminder to like the video if you're still here and enjoying yourself, and also consider subscribing and ringing that bell. I would really appreciate it because I love when you guys show your support for me, and I would also love any suggestions for videos to come. You can leave those in the comments or however else you think possible. So, okay, I don't know where I'm going with this, but thank you guys for at least being here at the halfway point. I hope you reach the end. Okay, enjoy. Bye. The 4th book that I ended up reading for the month of April was another book for my grad school classes, and that was Michel Foucault's The History of Sexuality, Introduction, Volume 1. And I say that because there are multiple volumes, because Foucault was a maniac in the best way when it came to trying to record his thoughts and his theories as a philosopher when it came to sexuality and its history in not only America or Europe, but just in general throughout the ages across the globe. I really appreciated reading this book, even though I'm not necessarily someone who enjoys reading philosophy or theorists for fun. I enjoy reading them so I can apply them to literature, because I think that that is an amazing way to grow as a person, as well as to connect at a deeper level with the literature or the author of the time. I probably will not read it again just because it was a lot to read, but if you're super interested in it, and he was a gay man who I believe ended up passing away from AIDS, and he was fighting to, if I understand his own situation well, he was fighting to complete this collection as he was dying from AIDS. And so I just really appreciated the importance that he put on it, and it's a really fascinating way to dissect sexuality in regards to power and knowledge, and the pleasure that one may get not only from enacting said power, but from resisting a power that may be acting against you. So it was really fascinating. I really appreciated it, and it actually went really well with one of the books that I'll be discussing later. So I ended up giving it 3 stars. Ugh. I ended up giving it 3 stars, and yeah, this was another book to just appreciate that it exists. The 5th book that I ended up finishing was actually a, oh wait, I should grab it. 1 second. Found it. The 5th book I ended up finishing was A Conspiracy in Belgravia by Sherry Thomas. This is the 2nd book in the Lady Sherlock series, and I ended up reading the first one, I believe, in, was it December 2019, I think, which is kind of crazy because I didn't think it had been that long. So I finally ended up picking up the 2nd book in the series, and I gave the first book 5 stars. I gave this book 5 stars as well. This is such a fun retelling when it comes to Sherlock Holmes, because basically Sherry Thomas reimagines Sherlock Holmes as a woman during 19th century London, and it complicates things tenfold. While society knows Sherlock Holmes as a man, Sherlock Holmes, the person behind this type of mask is Charlotte Holmes, a young woman who is brilliant and does not want to live a life that society expects of her. And by society, I'm talking capital S, this upper class echelon of social norms. Women must marry well when it comes to respectful gentlemen, and by respectful I mean rich, pretty much. And in the first book, basically Charlotte finds a way to avoid that fate, and she does so pretty much by ruining her name, and this causes a lot of problems, but it also allows her a lot of freedom because now she's not suitable for marriage. And while that adds to a lot of struggles in her life in the beginning, she ends up, getting back on her feet, finding the help of Mrs. Watson, who assists her in pretty much creating investigative, what's it called? an investigative office, in a sense, where it's another property owned by Sherlock Holmes, and it's a front. Pretty much Charlotte, with the help of Mrs. Watson and a few others that they trust, they solve crimes, and they also just solve mysteries, whether they be domestic or more serious issues across London. When it comes to book 2, though, it's established, and it just becomes more complicated because a woman who Charlotte happens to know as Lord Ingram's wife, who's a bit estranged. Their marriage kind of has fallen apart, and it's loveless since we've discovered that Lady Ingram married Lord Ingram for the economic security, which, honestly, can you blame her? But, well, whatever, that's a side issue. Anyway, so she comes to Charlotte thinking that she is Sherlock Holmes, and pretty much admits that there was a man prior to meeting Lord Ingram, but he was an illegitimate child, and so he was not suitable for marriage. And so she has this agreement with this man to see him once a year and just acknowledge, okay, you're okay, I'm okay, and that's it. He does not show up to their meeting place, and she begins to worry that something's happened to him. So this begins a crazy search for the man in question, and that man ends up being Charlotte Holmes's half-brother, who is illegitimate, and she's never actually met him. And it also introduces Moriarty. He's a very distant character. We don't learn anything about him, but we just know he's very powerful, and he has connections everywhere, and pretty much everyone's like, don't even talk about him, don't even try to go up against him, because it seems to be a fruitless endeavor. So I had so much fun. I honestly thought that I knew more than I did, which is always fun to kind of discover by the time the solution happens. There are definitely some mysteries that are solvable within this book, but the overall grand arcing mystery is deliciously ingenious. And yeah, I had a lot of fun getting to know the characters, specifically Livia Holmes in this one. She is Charlotte Holmes's older sister, who is honestly as clever as Charlotte Holmes, but they're polar opposites when it comes to their demeanor and their views on the world. While Charlotte feels removed and doesn't really feel the pressures of society, Livia feels heavily pressured to succeed in the way that society expects of her. And I just ended up falling in love with her, especially because there's a suitor in here that you can see. Literally, these green marks are just her interactions with this mysterious man, and I had so much fun with it. So I cannot wait to read book 3. Hopefully I can read it soon. I'll put up a little image of it because I can't remember what the title is, but in case you're interested, I'll have it up as a graphic to the side. And yeah, hopefully I'll read it sooner than I ended up picking this one up. 5 stars, so excited. Yeah. All right, book 6 is actually the book that I had mentioned briefly when I was talking about the history of sexuality, and it was the book that my professor paired with this philosopher. It was Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. I actually had never read this book before. I know it's a classic, and it's honestly another amazing social commentary type of novel, specifically when it comes to queer theory, as well as feminism and gender norms. I will say that one problem I had with the book is that there is a heavy amount of misogyny in there, which isn't surprising for the time in general, but especially, say, for Oscar Wilde, who was a gay man in hiding, and actually when he ended up being arrested for sodomy later on, much later, I think, or no, not much later, maybe about 10 years after The Picture of Dorian Gray came out. Understandably, he probably had his own mixed relationship when it came to women, and I don't have to be a fan of it, so that is just my own personal opinion that, yeah, it didn't sit right, even though you expect it of the time. I will say that I did very much appreciate Oscar Wilde's kind of humor, or at least subtle acknowledgments of the fact that Dorian Gray is actually very feminine and his vanity, his beauty is what women are expected of, especially, you know, of the time and of today. A lot of times women are told that once they lose their beauty or their youth, they lose a lot of their worth in society. So I thought that was an interesting twist to place that type of pressure on Dorian Gray. And it honestly has a lot of parallels to the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So if you ever wanted to pair those two together, I think that that would be really fascinating, because so many scenes are literally images of each other, like mirror images. So yeah, I'm really glad I read that book. I think that it could be interesting to return to in, say, a few years, in the same way I did with the Awakening. But yeah, I think that I actually got more out of it by it being in a grad class than I probably would have gotten on my own. So I'm really glad that I was able to do it with, say, a book club in a sense, in a classroom full of other students who were really interested in discussing this book. So when it comes to The Picture of Dorian Gray, I ended up giving this book 3 stars. A solid 3 stars. The final book that I ended up reading for April was by Claudia Gray, and it's called The Murder of Mr. Wickham. This book was actually given to me by NetGalley. So it was an ARC, Advanced Reader's Copy, and it was an ebook. So I don't have the physical book, but that's because it actually isn't out yet. It comes out officially on May 3rd, and I am so excited because I will 100% be buying a physical copy of this book. Now, when I requested it on NetGalley, this is probably not the way you should do it, and I'm a bit embarrassed to admit it, but I fell in love with the cover, and I fell in love with just the idea of it being a historical fiction mystery. That's something I've been really into, obviously, knowing the various books I've been reading lately. So I requested it probably, it might have been in January, and I ended up getting the publishers to accept my request, which is amazing. But when I ended up getting the book and I finally started reading it, because I was like, May 3rd is coming up, I realized that this is an ode for Jane Austen. Janeites, if that's how you pronounce it, will literally eat this book up, I think. I am not necessarily in that category when it comes to Jane Austen, because I just haven't read all of her books. I've read Pride and Prejudice twice, both times for classes, and just, I think it was last winter or the winter before, I read Sense and Sensibility with a friend who wanted to reread it. So those are the two books I read by Jane Austen, and I am very fortunate that I did, because it made The Murder of Mr. Wickham so much better. I think that I would have honestly adored the book anyway, but it was nice to know that I could at least partake a little bit in the hints and the nods to the books that these characters are based off of. Now, Claudia Gray, she introduces, pretty much the iconic couples of Jane Austen's previous books. For instance, Pride and Prejudice, of course, provides us with the Darcys. So the Darcys are in this book. With Sense and Sensibility, Marianne and Colonel Brandon are featured. We've got Anne Wentworth and Captain Wentworth. We've got the Knightleys, so Emma and Mr. Knightley. I don't know if I ever knew his name, and we also have what else? The Bertrams are also featured. What's fun is Claudia Gray, the author, she has the timeline, assuming that time has passed since all these books have been published. So with Pride and Prejudice, for instance, the Darcys have been married for 20 years and they have children. They have like an 18-year-old son who is also in the book, which is just so fun to see. And then Marianne and Colonel Brandon have only been married for 5 months at this point. So it was really fun to see the timeline and how Gray made the effort to have them align in unique ways. The sleuths in this book are honestly so fun, and their chemistry together is amazing. We've got Jonathan Darcy, who I'd mentioned before, the son of the Darcys, but we also have a Miss Juliet Tilney, who has no connection with anyone, really. She's just 17, wants to experience the world a bit more, at least her parents want her to, as she comes of age. And so, as an acquaintance of the Knightleys, she is brought into this big house party along with all these other Jane Austen characters. And then Mr. Wickham, George Wickham, if you remember, was the antagonist in Pride and Prejudice, which is, again, thank God, at least out of all of the Jane Austen books I've read, Pride and Prejudice was one of them. So that's a recommendation. If you haven't read any of them, you probably should at least read that one. And he ends up dying. It's so interesting because you know that someone in the house committed the murder, and the only people with solid alibis are Jonathan Darcy. And while Juliet Tilney doesn't have an alibi, she's the one who discovers the body, and she's the only one who doesn't have any previous connection with George Wickham, so they're very certain that she wasn't a part of it. So these two team up, and while they, defy and question certain social norms that would prevent them from investigating a crime, especially with someone of the opposite sex, they are just so good. I love how authentic Claudia Gray has these certain social norms, expectations of society, but she has this younger generation, in a sense, questioning those things and at least trying to compromise when they can so that they can investigate the murder a little bit better. I had so much fun with this book, and while I haven't read all of Jane Austen, it 100% made me want to. I have Emma on my shelf, so it will definitely be a priority read, I think, this summer. And yeah, I'm definitely buying a physical copy of The Murder of Mr. Wickham on May 3rd. So if you haven't already guessed, I gave this book 5 stars. It was probably the best book to end when it comes to my April reads, especially since I had a few dodgy books, or at least, some okay ones in this month, but it was really satisfying to have ended the month with a 5-star read. So highly recommend. Go get your copy and go pick up a few Jane Austen novels too while you're at it. And that is my April wrap up. I read 7 books, super happy with that result. I am surprised by how many mysteries I ended up reading. While I tend to lean towards mystery as a genre, I think usually my month reads are a bit more various, but 4 out of the 7 books I read were mysteries, and the other 3 were requirements for grad school. So that's a bit of an interesting development, and we'll see if that continues in months to come. I am super excited to see what I end up reading for May. I have quite a heavy backlog of books, specifically pre-orders. So, you know, lessons of the trade. I think I got a little pre-order happy when I decided, oh, Leandra, that's one thing you're allowed to do is pre-order books. Well, now I'm regretting that. But I intend to record my May TBR right after this. So you're going to see this shirt again. You're going to see me in this position with just a different stack of books. But for now, thank you so much for seeing this video to the end if you have. And if you really enjoyed it, then give the video a like, and also consider subscribing if you haven't, and ring that little bell so that you are among the first to be notified whenever another video like this pops up. Also, if you've read any of these books, I would love to have a conversation with you in the comments. Hear what you think. Did you also love these titles? Did you also hate some of these titles? I would really appreciate if you guys let me know. So either way, thank you for spending some of your time with me today, and have a great one. Bye, guys.
Wow!